Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Hidden Human Story Radio with your host, Rita Jean Moran. Today is Thursday, August 22nd, 2013, and I am your host, Rita Jean Moran. Tonight we have a very special guest who will talk to us about the mysterious red-headed elongated skulls of Peru, Mr. Brien Foerster. I find the subject absolutely fascinating, as those familiar with my research know that the ancient texts and mythologies speak about global journeys of the gods and goddesses. Now, Brien, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Well, Brien, let's start right in. Can you please tell the audience about your background and how you ended up in Peru?
Well, basically my story is that I've had an interest in native cultures, indigenous cultures, since I was a young child. I grew up on the west coast of Canada, and so I was exposed to people like the Haida, who were the totem pole carvers. I actually became a professional totem pole carver at the age of 25 for about 10 years. Then I moved to Hawaii and got involved with the Hawaiian people. And then I traveled through Polynesia quite a lot. And after that, I just seemingly naturally decided to study the ancient cultures of Peru, especially the Inca.
Fascinating. Now, how did you discover these red-headed, elongated skulls? How did you get into that?
Well, basically, my wife and I were traveling back from southern Peru, and we stopped in a small town on the coast south of Lima called Paracas, and there's a small museum that had one example of an elongated human skull that had reddish hair. I found it quite intriguing, and so I asked the museum director about it, and he said he had more at his house, and so I convinced him to bring them into the museum, and that began the collection of elongated skulls of Paracas, of which there are now about 40 in that little museum.
Wow. Now, are there any blonde-haired skulls that go along with this that are elongated as well?
No, actually, since I've started studying this about 3 years ago in earnest, it seems like the majority of the elongated skulls that have had still have vestiges of hair. The hair tends to be this reddish-brown color, whereas later cultures like the Inca, etc., tended to have black hair.
Interesting. Now, Brien, I want to ask a series of questions so you can answer them in any order that you want, and I'm just going to throw them all out at you. Has there been any physical anthropologist who's been able to examine these skulls, and are there complete skeletons available, and has height of any of these, if there are skeletons, has any of that been determined? Are there any double rows of teeth on these skulls? And was there any DNA testing done? And if so, what were the results?
Well, basically, archaeologists and anthropologists in Peru have known about these elongated skulls, especially in the area of Paracas, since the 1920s, but no one has done a serious investigation of them. There have been found more than 300 complete skeletons in the form of mummy bundles, where each body, including the head, was mummified in a fetal position, and all of those skeletons are presently in the collection of the National Museum in Peru, but they are not open for investigation as far as I know, and that's why most of my work has been independent, and I'm basically at the forefront of this because I lived in Paracas itself for 2 years solely studying this subject. So far, we haven't found any examples with double rows of teeth, and from some preliminary investigation, we found that the average size of these people who lived 2,000 plus years ago was about 6 feet tall.
Wow. How did you guys find out that they were about 2,000 years old? I'm just curious on that one.
Well, the Paracas culture disappeared 2,000 years ago, and they were replaced by the famous Nazca culture, the people who created the lines and geoglyph figures in the desert just south of Paracas.
Ah, I see. Okay. This one, again, you can answer it in any order you would like. Can you tell the audience how these skulls seem to be a global phenomenon? Because I've personally done some research and found that similar skulls have been found all over the planet, including some out of Lovelock Cave in Nevada. Down in Arkansas, I actually visited several pits that were open with replicas, and they had elongated skulls. Egypt has a lot of pictures of pharaohs and the pharaoh's family with elongated skulls. England, Robert the Bruce was said to have a strange skull. And France, I know they did some head binding. And there are also some skulls found in Russia and China. So if you can talk a little bit about how this is a global phenomenon, because I know you're starting to branch out a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, actually, David Hatcher Childress, the famous adventurer and publisher, and I wrote a book a year and a half ago called The Enigma of Cranial Deformation, and that's where we studied the phenomenon of head binding, which occurred all over the world. As you said, actually in Iraq, very ancient Iraq, in Russia, Europe, including Germany, England, the island of Malta, possibly in Egypt, Central America, Melanesia, maybe in China. It was a global phenomenon approximately 2,000 years ago. So what I'm working on now is differentiating between examples of obvious cranial head binding or deformation and those that seem to have been born with elongated skulls.
Interesting. Now, I just want to make a quick comment to the audience. I do believe we'll have some time after the interview for phone calls. So if you have any questions, you can call in at 347-637-3299. I believe we'll have some time after this to take some phone calls. Okay, so back to that question. I also know that there's been a lot of head binding with the Chinook Indians and some of the other, like the Mayans. Have you found any evidence that some of these skulls were as a result of head binding, or does it appear to not be the case?
Actually, the majority of them, no matter what culture you go to, they seem to be the result of head binding, and especially the ones that are more recent. You mentioned the Flathead Indians. There are also the Kwagulf Indians of the west coast of Canada. And from what David Childress and I were able to find out, there are three characteristics in each culture which seem to be universal. Number one, an elongated skull was thought to be something which was beautiful. Number two, it was thought that that increased the intelligence of the people. And number three, it was only done in the royal family of any culture. That's a universal thing. And what's also very common is that it's thought that that look, that elongated head look, is what their ancestors looked like.
Interesting. Well, now, Brien, you're doing some studying of the ancient architecture as well. And I wonder if you could tell your audience what you have found concerning some of the megalithic structures around the world.
Well, especially evident in Peru and Bolivia, anywhere you find megalithic structures, as in buildings or walls, etc., that are made out of very large hewn stone, and it's always very hard stone, you always find evidence of elongated skulls there as well. And so the problem is that conventional archaeology has not tended to do carbon-14 testing of the skulls, and so they simply will state that the skulls belong to the culture that theoretically made the megalithic structures. But the more work I'm doing, I'm finding out that the megalithic structures and buildings predate all of the known famous cultures. For example, the Inca of Cusco, where you find these beautiful walls where you can't fit a human hair in between the stone. The more work that I'm doing with geologists and engineers and other people, the more we're finding out that those buildings are thousands of years older than the Inca culture, and it's quite possible that the elongated skulls are of that age as well, much older.
Interesting. Now, I understand that some of these skulls have been deliberately destroyed, and I've seen this behavior with some of the ancient sites in America, such as the Gotchel site in Wisconsin. There was actually somebody that came in with a chainsaw and tried to cut out part of the petroglyph that was inside a cave, but they were unsuccessful. And due to that area was filled up and closed off. And then there were some mummies in Lovelock Cave and found in the 1920s that were supposed to be red-haired and found by some miners. But strangely, a fraternity got a hold of some of the best specimens and burnt them in a bizarre ritual. And a lot of those mummies have disappeared, although there's some elongated skulls still floating around in the museums in Nevada. Now, my question to you, Brien, is what are your thoughts about this deliberate destruction, and do you have any thoughts on who might be doing it and why?
Well, the thing is, I've recently been working with a researcher called Eli Marzulli from Los Angeles, and he's a proponent of the biblical idea of the fallen angels, that the fallen angels, in fact, were this red-haired race or races of people living in the area that we call Israel, and that they had red hair, they were very tall people, and that they were basically either eradicated or chased out of that area and migrated into the Americas through North America, Central America, possibly South America. And it seems that during the 19th century and early 20th century, and especially in North America, whenever a red-haired skull was found, with or without skeleton, often the skeletons were called giants. They're very tall people, and that it seems that the Smithsonian and other institutions have been collecting these specimens and hiding them away from the public and trying to erase any history of them existing. But of course, there are probably hundreds of newspaper articles from the 19th century in the United States stating that many of these, that these so-called giants were found, including the Lovelock area that you've been speaking about.
Oh, yeah, I've seen some of those articles. Very interesting. And I don't know if you've had time to get into any of the stuff I've done, but I've found some ancient texts that describe global travels, which is a subject for another day. But I definitely think there's some kind of a deliberate effort to just wipe out this history. And now that we're in the age of DNA testing, it seems to be even more of an effort. And we have some laws in America called NAGPRA, which is I think it has, if I can remember, it was something like North American Grave Repatriation Act, where if anything is found, it usually gets claimed and no scientific study is allowed, and the government will seize, whatever is found immediately before the scientists can finish their studies, and it disappears and is reburied. And there's several scientists in America that are actually going to court because of that. When they do find some sort of skeleton that doesn't fit, a traditional thought of who was native, and they're trying to, be able to do more scientific study. But that didn't come around until the 1990s when the DNA testing became more advanced. Before that, it really wasn't. It didn't seem to be a big deal, and sometimes they'll even, plow over some Native American mounds for a mall or something like that, and nobody seems to care. But as soon as they find one of these, skeletons that don't really fit in, it's amazing how everybody seems to swoop in and prevent any kind of realistic or scientific study of it, and then all of it disappears. Kennewick Man was one of those, and there's been a few other ones, but it's interesting. Like you said, though, there were all kind of newspaper articles throughout the whole Midwest, all over the country, of these giant skeletons that were found, but they do, for some reason, really don't want that history known. And I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of curious as to why. But then again, you have to think about who's going to gain from that and who would be the losers. So that's an interesting thing. So, Brien, can you tell the audience what books and videos that you have written and are involved in on the subject, so they can take a look at that and go out and get it?
Sure. Well, actually, all of my books are available as ebooks on Amazon.com. I've written 13 so far. I'm writing number 14 right now, which actually is about our missing history. There was most likely a major Earth event that happened about 12,000 years ago that wiped out probably the majority of humanity, and that's where all of these incredible ancient megalithic structures come from. But I also wanted to mention that there are many Native American and Mesoamerican and South American oral traditions that speak about these ancient, very tall, red-haired people. And in many cases, they're spoken of as being people who lived in the Americas prior to Native Americans coming across the Bering Land Bridge. So it's in Native tradition as well.
Oh yeah, I've heard that too. It's almost like it's a different species of humanoid, and that they came, somehow either way before us or at the same time, and it just seems to be global. But definitely, I've heard about that, and a lot of the ancient mythologies, which is what I study. When you really get into what they're saying. Some of them, talk about blonde and red-haired gods. They give a description of, and bearded. That's the big one. That's a Caucasoid feature. But, sometimes you can even see some of the artifacts with the beard of their god, and that seems to be pretty global as well. So Brien, you do tours, and it looks like you were starting off in Peru, but you may be doing some Egypt and other tours. Can you tell the audience about what you have available?
Oh, sure. Well, actually, we have a tour coming up in October, which is full, but it's with Graham Hancock, who's the very famous researcher. We're going to be in the Cusco Sacred Valley area of Peru, which is the land of the Inca. Then after that, we're going to Lake Titicaca and Bolivia. And that area especially is where ancient tradition talks about people called the Viracochas. And they were, in fact, described as being very tall, light-skinned, bearded, and often having red hair. And they were great teachers of great antiquity. And then in November, we have Hugh Newman of Megalithomania from the United Kingdom, along with David Childress. We'll be doing the same basic area of Cusco, Lake Titicaca, Bolivia. And then L.A. Marzulli will be with us in January, and that's called On the Trail of the Nephilim. So that's covering more of the biblical idea that it was a global civilization of these very tall, red-haired, possibly elongated skull people.
Very interesting. Maybe someday I could get out one of those tours. Boy, I'd love to
Sure.
go down to Peru. Yeah, definitely. That's on my to-do list. Brien, where do you hope your research will go? Where do you foresee any of this going down the road?
Well, basically, I'm fortunate in that I'm able to converse with people like Graham Hancock and many other prominent researchers as well as geologists like Dr. Robert Schoch, who was the man who was able to redate the Sphinx of Egypt as being much older than the pharaohs. And so together we're working in harmony to bring all of this information to the public so that we can see that as human beings, our civilization and civilizations go back many thousands of years prior to what conventional anthropology and archaeology talks about. And I simply think it's our birthright to know our true history as global citizens of this planet.
I agree with you on that. Okay, well, I have my own theories on who these ancient giants were, but I want to get your point of view of who or what, do you think they were? Were they humanoid? Were they aliens? Were they reptoids? I mean, I've heard so much, all of these theories of what they were, and Nephilim, and that, mixture of this and that. What is your theory of who these, first of all, these red-haired people were and these giant people were?
Well, the thing is, again, there seems to have been a major event that happened on the planet about 12,000 years ago, which, is written down in many different cultures as being the Great Flood. It's not just in the Bible. And so from science, what we know now is that what happened was the end of the Ice Age was very fast. It wasn't something that took 1,000 years. It may have only taken 3 years to happen. And so the poles melted, global oceans rose by 350 feet, and so that meant a great displacement of humanity. And that's when these people, these red-haired, very tall people, seemed to suddenly appear in different parts of the world, especially in South America. And so I think what they were the remnants of a very high civilization that became heavily damaged, if not destroyed, by this global catastrophe. And, one name that comes to mind is they're called the Viracochas, and these were the people who lived in the high Andes and were the great teachers of much later cultures, such as the Inca.
Right. Now, do you think this, and I'm going to just kind of throw this out there, do you think that they might have been survivors of the fabled Atlantis that was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? And perhaps that's why it's more global?
Yeah, honestly, I think Atlantis should refer to a global civilization, not simply a continent that sank. But again, the thing is that oral tradition is always poetry in nature, and so you can't really derive information directly from it. So I think the idea that the continent sank simply refers to the fact that the world oceans rose by 350 feet, and therefore a lot of landmass disappeared. And since any high culture would have a tendency of living close to the ocean due to the ability to navigate and travel around the world, that they were displaced and they had to move often to higher ground. And I think that's why all of a sudden these people appeared in the area of the Andes in Peru and Bolivia.
Yeah, I would agree on that. Now, audience, we do have a little bit of time left. If you would like to call in, 347-637-3299 is the number, and I've got a few more questions left for Brien. Okay, so, I'm just kind of curious, do you think any of this might go off planet? Because there's a big, a group of researchers that, basically tend to go in that direction, whereas myself personally, I don't feel it's from off planet. I kind of feel it's more from this planet, although I'm open to that research if I could see some evidence.
Well, actually, I'm very open to that as well. And the thing is, there are DNA tests being done right now with the DNA of elongated skulls from Peru, and they're being carried out by Dr. Melba Ketchum from Texas. And so she stated that maybe after Labor Day we'll get initial mitochondrial DNA results. And so the first thing would be that data, if it's good data, then it will be compared with the global human database. And if there are any anomalies in that DNA, then that would point either to a different species or subspecies of humanity, or if the DNA is so profoundly different, then it could point to there having been some kind of off-planet interaction between off-world beings and human beings at some time in the very distant past.
Interesting. Now, Brien, in my research, I've come across a lot of ancient writings from Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, some of the Nordic, and a little bit of the Mayan and Aztec codices that talk about an ancient war. And this war was described, in a manner of almost modern warfare technology. And after this war, the planet seemed to have been just destroyed, and whatever people were left had to start over. Have you seen any of this information or evidence in your research that talks about this?
Well, what I've seen it very much is that I've seen obvious examples of what we would call lost ancient technology. Especially when I was in Egypt in April, we saw very obvious examples of high-speed drills, high-speed saws being used in very deep antiquity around the area of the Great Pyramids. We had engineers with us who will back that information up. And in Peru and Bolivia, we see incredible precision in working in stone that could not have been done with hand tools or primitive tools by so-called primitive people. So I think those are what you would call the vestiges or remnants of a lost period of human civilization when there was very much high technology in use, but something terrible happened which destroyed the people and probably all the tools themselves, and all we're left with are the stone remnants.
Yeah, there was definitely something cataclysmic that happened, and I have seen some of your work where you were showing, just the holes in some of these rocks, and I just can't imagine somebody doing that with another, stone drill by hand. That just doesn't seem to explain that. So there does appear to have been something that was advanced but lost. And I've actually seen in my study of some ancient writings that one of these gods understood the property of lodestone and the magnetic quality of it with iron, and he worked with that. That was Osiris. But so they definitely weren't, an ignorant people. I mean, they seem to have some very good technology and some higher concepts of how things worked and how to build things. Have you done any kind of underwater research, and would you ever think about doing that?
Personally, no, I haven't, but Graham Hancock has written a very extensive book called Underworld, where he explored the evidence that there are cities that are underwater in many different parts of the world, especially off the south coast of India, and that these areas have been heavily restricted by governments. No one's allowed to dive on them. David Hatcher Childress believes that there are many cities that are actually underwater in the Mediterranean. And again, if any of these places are within 350 feet of the present surface of the oceans, then that gives us evidence that 12,000 plus years ago, those cities and buildings were above the oceans at that time. Again, I think there obviously is some kind of cover-up and restriction globally being done to restrict us from learning the true nature of who we are and where we come from. But because of Google Earth and all of these great technologies that we have at our disposal, including the Internet, we are allowed to freely exchange this information and don't have to depend upon governmental sources for information anymore.
Oh, agreed on that. Yeah, they just had some big to-do about finding the lost city of Krishna off of India. And I've always been curious about Giant's Causeway in Ireland on that northern side. They're, I believe it's hexagonal stones. It almost looks like a fallen walkway, and there's a story that a giant built it to go from island to island. So, I don't know if anybody's gone underwater, but that would be something interesting. Well, Brien, what could people do to make or help this research become mainstream?
Well, I think the main thing is just to, the reason why I make so many videos, I have almost 700 on YouTube now, is to spread the information out. So if people would simply watch them and then share them with their friends, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I just like to present the information to them and let them make their own minds up. But there are many, many researchers, including yourself now, and increasing in number as we go along, that are presenting more and more of this evidence to the public. And the more that we can piece the puzzles back together again, the more we'll get quite a full understanding of who we are and where our roots actually come from, compared to what we've been told.
I agree. Now, we don't have any callers, but is there, as I'm losing my voice here, but last question is there anything else you would like to add tonight that I haven't asked?
Oh, actually, I think it would be great if you welcome me back to another show and we could discuss much more, because we've only touched the very tip of the iceberg on this subject. Everything is interrelated. The ancient history, the lost technology, the elongated skulls, the red hair, the megaliths, etc. They're all components of one big picture. So I'd very much like to come back on your show sometime and discuss more.
Well, Brien, go ahead. We've got time. If there's something that I missed, I don't want to cut you off. Or I could get you on for another show as well. Either way, whatever you'd like to do.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to come back sometime and discuss more.
I would love that. That would be great. And I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. And this has been very informative. And I will have you back on, and I'll have a set of many more questions for you. And I'm going to end the show, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it. And until next time, take care.